the whiteness that is imposed on her subjectivity is now, it sort of becomes a form of starvation. So Miranda is starved of difference. She is sort of starved of relationality, and she is, and that kind of also then raises these ethical questions about how do you relate to the foreign, how do you relate to the other, whether it's as a substance or as food or as another person or as another culture or as another skin color. How do you relate to the other, and what is the ethical mode of relating to the other? Do you appropriate the other? So there is this instance where Miranda, when she is in a moment of possession, and she sort of makes a note of this also, that do not consume, or is not food. She starts sucking the life force out of ore, and this is also a reference to the Caribbean myth of the succubant, who's again this figure who is also playing on this idea of transcending one's corporeal self, which is to basically sublimate or transcend, or essentially just sort of annihilate the flesh altogether and become disembodied. And so the succubant has the ability to disembody herself and leave her skin behind, quite literally, and again the reference to skin and color and its racial overtones, but essentially inhabit the body of another person and like draw out the soul or the life force of that person. So the succubant is someone who thrives on the souls of other people, and again as a form of consumption. It's a very interesting idea as a kind of monstrous consumption, and how that relates to pica as an eating disorder. And so Miranda, is the succubant figure, and so she is sucking the life force out of Ore, and Ore feels that, she feels like she is not able to breathe, and she feels completely depleted, by this interaction. So it's very interesting that, in some senses, pica becomes a form of resistance to this purity kind of principle, and it's sort of this very act of appropriating the other, and in the process of appropriating the other, annihilating the other, becoming of a form of desire for the other, and a form of drawing nourishment from what the other represents, and what is perceived as a lack in the self. And so there is this very interesting dynamic that is played out through Miranda's pica. So she sort of says in the end that she's going down against the house, simply because she is too much in love with Ore. And I didn't quite, so if there's any point of criticism or critique that I would level against this book, it is just this one thing. I didn't quite like the ending. I felt that it sort of ends with this, there is this kind of gloom and doom kind of an ending, where it seems as if which is perfectly, I think, in keeping with the Gothic. If you think of the novel as a Gothic novel, this is very much in keeping with the Gothic tradition of kind of the sort of the monstrous feminine sort of being eliminated, or sort of being contained in some senses, which I also felt was slightly problematic, that the book really doesn't challenge that in the end, or the ending doesn't challenge that completely, and also the fact that it almost seems to suggest that that's probably the only way an eating disorder can end. So it kind of like seems a little bit, I just felt that it was kind of reductive. In a way, it is quite refreshing, because it does not peter into a kind of redemptive sort of narrative of recuperation, or a sort of a happy ending of where the diseases it's sort of eliminated and she's healed. And so like one of the good things about this book is that it does not medicalize, and of course the Gothic itself allows for that. But there is no attempt to medicalize the illness, or to kind of provide this medical model of cure, and to privilege the medical model of cure. So very early on in the book, we do have we do see Miranda institutionalized right at the beginning. She tries that option, but very early on, the medical option is kind of seen as redundant. It's not seen as very helpful to her specific condition. The other thing that, again, as I said before, that the eating disorder is seen as part of a larger intergenerational process of trauma, unhealed trauma or unresolved trauma. So this relationship between trauma, a traumatized past, and traumatic unconscious, and its implications for, or its repercussions on the bodies of women, sort of inheriting. So Miranda is not just inheriting the genetic disorder, she's also, or the kind of, she's not only inheriting ghostly possession, she also inherits trauma. And it's possible, of course, to see possession as a metaphor for the kind of transmission of trauma. And there have been readings of the book, the narrative, as an instance of post-memory, and that's actually one way of looking at it. But I liked the fact that Oyeyemi very consciously locates, eating disorder within this larger socio-historical, cultural field, and identifies it as so much more than epidemiology, so much more than what the medical discourse, so much more than what psychopathology as a medicalized rubric allows. So in that sense, the ending is apposite, and it's kind of productive. But I also feel that suicide as a kind of even though it is suicide again as a reiteration, so suicide via her pica, because she consumes batteries in the end, which is very much in keeping with, so it's almost like a performance of her eating disorder as a form of resistance against the house. But again, death and suicide as being a kind of ending, being a kind of telos, sort of like resolution, felt. I was a little uncomfortable with that, along with the silencing of the two figures actually, Said, the housekeeper, or they are both of African origin, and the fact that they are both silenced in the end. And they've also been very intrepid in opposing the machinations of the house, and the fact that they are both they disappear and they're silenced was a bit disappointing for me personally as a reader. So that's something that death or whatever happens to her. So in the scheme of the narrative logic, being subsumed, basically what Anna Good wanted, that she's subsumed into the house. Now the only last form of resistance that we do see, like there's this flicker of resistance that we do see, is that her shoes, the empty shoes, they become this site for communication. So she sort of communicates from wherever she is in the house through the shoes, and in that she also manages to dissociate or differentiate herself from her ancestresses, because she actively communicates, and her mode of communication is not through possession or through haunting of a certain kind, but it is through this liquid. It's this red liquid which smells of roses, reference to blood for sure, but it's not blood. So and she communicates with her brother. Her shoes fill with that liquid every night, and blood, of course, as the again quintessential symbol of impurity and taboo, and again porosity and wounding and permeability and vulnerability, and of course miscegenation. So the blood, the red, almost seems to stain in that sense, finally, as this kind of final act of subversion, though not very overt, but covert subversion, this myth of white supremacy and that I thought was quite interesting. But other than that, really, there is no Miranda sort of disappears, right? And I also did not like the fact that Or is completely silenced at the end. We do not hear from her. It is almost as if the house seems to have the last word, and the final words actually belong to the brother, who is something of a shady, sketchy character in the novel. He himself is quite sort of prejudiced, is racially prejudiced, and also not a very reliable narrator. Nobody is a very reliable narrator in the book, but he certainly is not very reliable. So he kind of gets the last word, and Or is completely silent. So she just disappears from the text, absolutely disappears. I mean, that was a little disappointing for me. But in all, I think the extensive kind of treatment of disordered eating in the book, and the subjectivity of someone with an eating disorder, because Miranda is both. She's not just a gothic heroine experiencing possession and sort of losing her bodily autonomy to this external force, which is ideologically laden, but she's also anorectic. She also has pica. So both of these are valid, and this is very interesting interplay of the two. And I think that's where the book acquires its critical acumen, in the way in which race and gender, racial oppression and patriarchal oppression, whiteness and femininity as discursive ideals sort of intersect and play out in the figure, in the body of Miranda Silver. And yeah, so I think it's actually a really good book, and I'm sort of at the very beginning of my research. So these are actually thoughts from off the top of my head, and I will develop them, of course. These are actually very raw thoughts that I'm sharing, but it is a great book, and I would give it a 3.5, maybe 3.8 on 5. I also really liked the narrative structure. I have read a lot of reviews, especially on Goodreads, which were critical of the narrative structure because it's supposedly too discordant and difficult to follow and jumps too much. But I thought the narrative structure is brilliant. It's a fragmented narrative. It's a very heteroglossic narrative. It's told from different points of view. So and it jumps. Yes, it jumps. And there's this brilliant use of these transition words. Again, the narrative itself goes completely against the architecture of the haunted house. It's completely, or in many ways, it also embodies the very nature of the bed and breakfast. How it sort of becomes this capacious space that accommodates difference and diversity, and and these transition points are actually forms of textual miscegenation, because you have this one word where one person's narrative trails off and another person's narrative begins. So I think the narrative is brilliant. It's fractured, and the house is also one of the speakers, like one of the witnesses, aptly so in the book. And it shifts between, so the entire plot is actually it's narrated via these shifts in perspective from one person to the other, or one voice to the other. So it's a very brilliant sort of, I think, polyphony happening. And there is a lot more that one could talk about, but I will stop here. I will leave you with these. There's a lot already. But it is a great book, and I highly recommend it. So that is it for this video. So this was Helen Oyeyemi's White is for Witching, published in 2009. I think it's a Random House. No, it's Hamish Hamilton, Canada. But I think there is also Penguin. Yes, there is a Penguin version as well. There's a Penguin edition as well. So yeah, that is it for this video. Please let me know your thoughts. Please comment and subscribe and like if you want to, if you find anything useful from these ramblings, and please let me know what kind of content you would like to see, whether you want to see more traditional teaching type, lecture type content, like whether you would like me to discuss texts, academic texts, I mean, I could do that as well. Or if the review is the review format is fine. I personally prefer the review format. I just prefer talking about books and then branching into issues and ideas from there. So yeah, but do let me know. I look forward to your comments. That is it for this video. That is it for today's video. And stay well and take care. And I will see you next time. Bye.